May 8, 1945. The Harz Mountains, central Germany. Dawn light filters through pine trees onto a scene that should not exist. A laboratory built inside a mountain, its steel doors blown open by American engineers, its corridors filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burned electrical insulation. In the main research chamber, a dozen German scientists stand with their hands raised, surrounded by soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. The scientists are not looking at their captors. They are looking at a young American corporal, barely 23 years old, who sits cross-legged on the concrete floor surrounded by pieces of their most advanced radar guidance system. He has disassembled it in 17 minutes. Now he is rewiring it, his hands moving with the fluid certainty of a concert pianist, connecting components in sequences the German engineers recognize as theoretically possible, but practically impossible. One of the German scientists, Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, a physicist who spent 4 years developing this system, whispers to his colleague in German, "Das ist unmöglich." It is impossible. The American corporal, without looking up, replies in perfect German, "Not impossible, just inefficient the way you had it." His name is James Sterling, and he possesses an 8th-grade education from rural Kentucky. In the next 6 hours, he will explain to some of Germany's most educated minds how American soldiers with farm backgrounds and garage workshop experience have been systematically outthinking, outbuilding, and outwiring the Wehrmacht's most sophisticated technology. The Germans will listen in stunned silence, confronting a truth more devastating than military defeat, that their assumptions about education, expertise, and innovation were fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. To understand how a Kentucky farm boy came to humiliate German physics doctors in a mountain laboratory, one must first understand two completely different philosophies of knowledge, expertise, and human capability. In the Germany of the 1920s and 1930s, technical education was a cathedral, formal, hierarchical, credentialed. To become an electrical engineer required years at a technical university, examinations administered by state boards, certifications that carried the weight of law. The German system produced engineers of extraordinary theoretical knowledge, men who could calculate impedance and inductance to 4 decimal places, who understood Maxwell's equations as poetry, who approached technology with the precision of surgeons and the reverence of priests. This system was Germany's pride, the foundation of its industrial might, the source of innovations that had made German engineering synonymous with excellence. But the German system had a flaw, though no one recognized it as such, until American soldiers began taking apart German equipment and rebuilding it better. The flaw was simple. German technical education was designed to produce experts who knew the right way to solve problems. American technical education, such as it existed, was designed to produce people who could solve problems whether they knew the right way or not. James Sterling grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the Appalachian coal fields where formal education ended for most boys at age 14, and real education, the kind that kept machines running and families fed, never stopped. His father was a coal mine mechanic who maintained the electrical hoists and pumps that kept the mines from flooding. Young James learned electrical systems the way most children learn language, by immersion, by necessity, by watching his father diagnose problems not with textbooks, but with intuition, born from 10,000 hours of hands-on experience. When a pump failed at 3 in the morning and water was rising in the shaft, you did not consult engineering manuals. You traced the problem with your hands, your ears, your sense of how electricity should flow, and you fixed it with whatever materials you had because the nearest electrical supply store was 40 miles away, and the water did not wait. By age 16, Sterling could rewire a house, rebuild a motor, diagnose a short circuit by the smell of the burning insulation. By age 18, he was maintaining all the electrical systems for 3 coal mines. He had never seen the inside of a university. He could barely write a grammatically correct sentence, but he understood electrical systems with an intimacy that no textbook could teach, because he had learned them not as abstract theory, but as living things with personalities and preferences and ways of failing. When America entered World War II in December 1941, Sterling enlisted in the Army because the mines were closing and because the recruiting poster promised technical training. The Army gave him aptitude tests. The results baffled the testing officers. Sterling scored in the bottom quartile on written examinations. He scored in the top 1% on mechanical aptitude. The Army, in its bureaucratic wisdom, assigned him to the Signal Corps and sent him to communication school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. The instructors at Fort Monmouth quickly realized they had a problem. Sterling could not follow the textbook lessons. He would read a chapter on circuit design and understand nothing. But if you gave him a broken radio and told him to fix it, he would have it working in minutes, often in ways the manual said were impossible. His solutions were inelegant, improvised, built from mismatched parts and intuitive leaps that violated every principle of proper engineering. They also worked reliably, often better than the original design. One instructor, Captain Robert Morrison, a former MIT electrical engineering professor, wrote in Sterling's evaluation, "This soldier possesses virtually no theoretical knowledge and cannot explain his methods in technical language. However, his practical ability with electrical systems is extraordinary. He approaches problems not as an engineer, but as a mechanic artist, seeing solutions that formal training would exclude. Recommend assignment to field maintenance, where his unorthodox skills may prove valuable." The Army sent Sterling to Europe in January 1944 as part of a Signal Corps maintenance unit attached to the 3rd Armored Division. His job was to keep communications equipment functioning under battlefield conditions, radios damaged by shrapnel, field telephones shorted by mud and rain, direction-finding equipment that failed in ways the manuals never anticipated. He was exceptionally good at this work, but what made him legendary among American units was something else entirely. Sterling could fix German equipment. Better than that, he could improve it. The German soldiers and scientists who encountered American technical personnel in 1944 and 1945 expected to meet inferiors. This was not arrogance, or rather, it was not merely arrogance. It was the product of decades of German technical superiority, of a justified belief that German engineering represented the pinnacle of human achievement. German optics were the world's finest. German chemistry had won Nobel Prizes. German electrical engineering had illuminated cities and powered industries when most of the world still used candles and horses. When German officers were captured or German facilities were overrun, they expected their captors to be impressed, perhaps overwhelmed, certainly incapable of understanding the sophistication of what they had created. What they experienced instead was profoundly disorienting. American soldiers would look at sophisticated German equipment, radar systems, encrypted communications gear, proximity fuses, with the appraising eye of farmers examining a neighbor's tractor. They would ask basic questions that revealed both ignorance of theory and deep understanding of practice. They would spot design flaws that German engineers had never noticed because the flaws violated no theoretical principles but caused practical problems in field conditions. Most disturbing, they would fix things quickly and effectively, using methods that should not work but did. Colonel Heinrich Vogel, commander of a German signals intelligence unit captured near Aachen in October 1944, described his interrogation in a diary that survived the war. "The American technical officer examining our equipment was a sergeant, enlisted rank, perhaps 25 years old. He spoke no German, had clearly minimal formal education, and yet within an hour had identified 3 design inefficiencies in our receiver array that our team had never addressed. When I asked about his training, he said he had worked on radios since he was a kid. I asked where he studied. He said, Radio Shack, apparently some kind of American shop. He then proceeded to demonstrate how our system could be reconfigured for 20% greater range using components we already possessed. I asked why we had not discovered this. He said, Maybe you followed the manual too close. This from a sergeant to a colonel with a doctorate in electrical engineering. The humiliation was profound, but more profound was the realization. We had lost not because their soldiers were better educated, but because their education had not confined their thinking. This pattern repeated across hundreds of encounters. German V-2 rocket scientists captured at Peenemünde found themselves explaining their work to American ordnance specialists who had learned explosives by blowing up tree stumps on family farms. German submarine designers at Kiel faced questions from U.S. Navy mechanics who had started as garage engine builders. German aircraft engineers discovered that American aviation mechanics could strip and rebuild their most advanced engines faster than German factory workers, and often identified improvements in the process. The German expectation was that technical sophistication required years of university training, formal credentials, respect for established methods. The American reality was that technical sophistication emerged from necessity, curiosity, and the freedom to ignore rules that did not serve practical purposes. The contrast was not merely embarrassing. It was philosophically devastating. It suggested that Germany's entire approach to knowledge and expertise might be fundamentally flawed. The documented evidence of American technical improvisation overwhelming. German theoretical sophistication is extensive, preserved in after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and the bewildered accounts of German personnel. In the U.S. National Archives, File Group 457, Box 89, contains a remarkable document, a technical intelligence report dated June 1944, titled Assessment of Enemy Communications Security. The report analyzes German military encryption systems captured during the Normandy campaign and includes this passage. German cryptographic equipment represents sophisticated application of theoretical principles. However, practical implementation reveals significant vulnerabilities. Several encoding machines examined by Signal Corps personnel were found to have mechanical weaknesses that substantially compromised security. These weaknesses were identified not through cryptanalysis, but through mechanical examination by enlisted technicians with backgrounds in lock mechanisms, typewriter repair, and mechanical toys. German designers appear to have prioritized theoretical elegance over practical robustness. The report was written by Major Charles Henderson, a former high school mathematics teacher. The enlisted technicians he referenced included a former locksmith, a typewriter repairman, and a man who had designed mechanical toys for a company in Ohio. None had university training in cryptography. All had spent their lives understanding how mechanical systems could fail, be manipulated, or be improved. Practical knowledge that theoretical training often overlooked. James Sterling's most documented achievement occurred in March 1945 near the town of Remagen, where American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine. German forces were using sophisticated radio-controlled guidance systems to direct explosive boats toward the bridge. American countermeasures were failing because the German system employed frequency-hopping technology that made jamming difficult. The Signal Corps brought in their best theoretical experts. They analyzed the system for 3 days and concluded that effective jamming would require equipment not available in theater. Sterling asked if he could examine one of the German control units that had been recovered from a destroyed boat. He took it apart on a table in a bombed-out building near the bridge. His examination took 45 minutes. His solution was ready 2 hours later. He had rewired a standard American SCR 300 radio, modified its frequency oscillator with components scavenged from a destroyed German truck radio, and created a device that flooded all the frequencies the German system used with random noise. The technical report filed by his commanding officer stated, Corporal Sterling's solution employed principles that violate standard signal theory and should not function as designed. However, field testing confirms complete effectiveness. German remote boats disabled. Bridge no longer threatened. Corporal Sterling unable to explain theoretical basis of his modifications, but insists it just made sense this way. Dr. Wilhelm Rahn, a German electrical engineer who was interrogated about the radio-controlled boat systems, was shown Sterling's modification after the war. His response, recorded in debriefing documents held at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, was, "This should not work. The impedance matching is wrong. The frequency stability should be inadequate. But if you say it worked, then I must accept that practical reality differs from theoretical prediction. This was always our weakness. We built what theory said was correct. Americans built what worked. These are not always the same thing. The evidence accumulates across domains. In aviation, American mechanics routinely improved German aircraft engines by modifying fuel mixture ratios and ignition timing in ways that German engineers insisted would cause failure, but instead increased performance. In armor, American ordnance crews found that German tank transmissions could be made more reliable by simplifying their complex gear trains, modifications that reduced theoretical efficiency but increased battlefield durability. In medicine, American medics discovered that German pharmaceutical dosing guidelines were overly conservative, calculated for laboratory conditions rather than battlefield realities, and adjusted them based on practical observation. The pattern was consistent. Germans designed for theoretical optimization, Americans modified for practical effectiveness. German excellence was theoretical, American excellence was empirical, and on the battlefield, empirical excellence won. The transformation of German understanding began not with defeat in battle, but with defeat in comprehension. When American units captured German research facilities in early 1945, the encounters between German scientists and American soldiers produced a cognitive dissonance that many German researchers never resolved. They had spent the war years convinced that German technical superiority was inevitable, a product of superior education systems, cultural discipline, and intellectual rigor. The presence of technically proficient American soldiers who lacked formal credentials challenged every assumption about how knowledge worked. The interrogation records from Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, reveal this transformation in painful detail. German researchers, initially confident in their superiority, gradually confronted evidence that their most sophisticated work was being understood, critiqued, and improved by Americans they had been taught to consider educational inferiors. Dr. Ernst Weber, a radar specialist captured at a facility near Nordhausen, described the experience in a 1947 interview preserved in the Smithsonian Institution archives. "We assumed Americans were technically primitive, capable of mass production but not innovation. When I saw an American sergeant, redesign our phase array antenna system to reduce side lobes, I experienced what I can only describe as intellectual vertigo. My doctorate meant nothing. My years of study meant nothing. This man with no formal training saw solutions I had not imagined because his mind was not constrained by proper methods. I realized then that Germany had lost not just a war, but an argument about the nature of knowledge itself." This realization spread through the German scientific community like a psychological contagion. Researchers who had believed that formal education was the only path to expertise now confronted Americans whose expertise emerged from informal experience. Scientists who had trusted in established methods now watched Americans succeed by ignoring those methods. Engineers who had designed systems according to theoretical principles now saw those systems improved by mechanics who did not know the theory and therefore were not limited by it. The transformation was not merely intellectual but emotional. German pride had been built on technical achievement. German identity was intertwined with engineering excellence. To discover that this excellence was, in certain practical dimensions, inferior to the improvised competence of American farm boys and garage mechanics was to discover that the foundation of German self-conception was false. Some German scientists never recovered from this realization. They spent the rest of their lives insisting that American methods were crude, inelegant, theoretically suspect. Others, particularly the younger ones, experienced a kind of liberation. If formal training was not the only path to expertise, then perhaps innovation was more accessible than German culture had allowed. Perhaps the rigid hierarchies of German technical education had been barriers rather than foundations. James Stirling's own transformation was quieter, but no less profound. He had grown up believing that his lack of formal education made him inferior to credentialed experts. The Army had reinforced this belief with its testing and classification systems. But by the war's end, Stirling had fixed German equipment that German engineers could not repair, had improved systems that German scientists had designed, had solved problems that defeated German technical expertise. In the process, he had discovered something about himself and about the nature of knowledge. That understanding came not from credentials, but from engagement, not from memorizing correct answers, but from developing intuitive grasp through countless hours of practical experience. In a letter written to his father in June 1945, Sterling described this realization. "Dad, I spent my whole life thinking I was dumb because I couldn't do school. But over here, I fixed things the smartest men in Germany couldn't fix. Not because I'm smarter than them, because I learned the way you taught me, by doing, by trying things, by not being afraid to be wrong. These German engineers, they're scared to try something unless they know it's right. Me, I just try it and see. Turns out that's worth something. Turns out maybe I'm not so dumb after all." The letter is held in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. It represents a small, personal transformation. One young man's realization that intelligence comes in forms that formal systems often fail to recognize. But multiplied across thousands of American soldiers with similar experiences, this transformation represented something larger. A validation of American pragmatism, of learning by doing, of the value of practical knowledge over theoretical purity. Throughout Sterling's service, he carried a small red toolbox 10 inches wide and 6 inches deep, made of steel and painted the color of a fire truck. It had belonged to his father, used in the coal mines of Kentucky, dented and scratched from years of service. Inside were tools that no military manual authorized, wire strippers modified by filing, pliers with bent handles for reaching impossible angles, screwdrivers ground to custom shapes for specific types of screws. These were not precision instruments from a technical supply catalog. They were improvised, adapted, modified through years of practical use to serve purposes their original manufacturers never intended. Sterling's toolbox became legendary in the 3rd Armored Division. Other Signal Corps soldiers would borrow tools from it, often marveling at their oddity and effectiveness. Officers would ask to see it, curious about what enabled Sterling's seemingly miraculous repairs. German scientists, when they encountered it during the examination of captured facilities, would study it with anthropological fascination, trying to understand what these crude, modified tools revealed about American technical culture. The toolbox was symbolic in ways that transcended its practical function. Each modified tool represented the American approach to problem solving. Adapt what you have, ignore what the manual says, make things work through ingenuity rather than proper procedure. The very fact that Sterling carried his father's tools, personal items in a military environment designed for standardization, symbolized American individualism, the belief that personal experience and family tradition could be more valuable than institutional training. In one documented incident from April 1945, Sterling was working on a German encryption device while a captured German engineer, Dr. Klaus Richter, observed. Richter noticed Sterling using a screwdriver that had been ground down to an impossibly thin edge, clearly modified from its original form. Richter asked through an interpreter why Sterling had ruined a perfectly good tool. Sterling replied that it wasn't ruined, it was improved for getting into tight spaces. Richter insisted that proper German tooling included precision instruments for such purposes. Sterling said he'd never had money for precision instruments, so he made what he needed. Richter was silent for a long moment, then said something the interpreter struggled to translate. The final translation was, "You make what you need. We need what we are told to make." Perhaps this explains everything. The toolbox symbolized American abundance not through quantity, but through adaptability. Germany had designed specialized tools for every purpose, precision instruments that required training and care. America had general tools that individuals modified to serve 1,000 purposes, practical instruments that valued functionality over perfection. Germany had an economy of specialization. America had an economy of improvisation. On the battlefield, improvisation proved more valuable. The toolbox also symbolized democratic knowledge. In Germany's hierarchical technical culture, tools and expertise were restricted by education and certification. Proper engineers used proper tools in proper ways. Stirling's toolbox, filled with modified instruments and improvised solutions, rejected that hierarchy. It insisted that anyone with curiosity and determination could become expert. That knowledge belonged not to credentialed elites, but to anyone willing to engage with problems directly, practically without reverence for established methods. After the war, Stirling brought the toolbox home to Kentucky. He worked as an electrician, then opened a small radio repair shop, then taught technical skills at a vocational school. The toolbox sat on his workbench for 40 years. Its tools still modified, still functional, still representing a philosophy of knowledge that had helped win a war and challenged assumptions about expertise, education, and human capability. James Stirling died in 1989, at the age of 67, in the same Kentucky county where he was born. His obituary in the Harlan Daily Enterprise occupied 3 column inches and mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It did not mention the German radar systems he had improved, the encryption devices he had cracked, the interrogations, where he had quietly demonstrated that American practical knowledge could surpass German theoretical expertise. It did not mention that he had been part of a larger phenomenon that helped redefine how military effectiveness, technical innovation, and human intelligence were understood. The story of Stirling and soldiers like him challenges comfortable assumptions about knowledge and expertise. The German model of technical education was not wrong. It produced genuine excellence, theoretical understanding of profound depth, innovations that changed the world. But the German model was incomplete. It failed to recognize that excellence could emerge from sources other than formal training, that theoretical knowledge without practical intuition was often less effective than practical intuition without theoretical knowledge, that the ability to improvise and adapt could be more valuable than the ability to execute established procedures perfectly. The American military's success in World War II is typically attributed to industrial capacity, numerical superiority, strategic bombing, and the contributions of allies. These factors were certainly decisive, but beneath them lay something less tangible and more profound. A culture that validated practical knowledge, that trusted individual problem-solving, that believed a Kentucky coal miner's son could, given the right circumstances, outsmart a German physics doctorate. This was not anti-intellectualism. It was an expanded definition of what intelligence meant and where it could be found. In the decades after the war, as German scientists were integrated into American research programs through Operation Paperclip, an interesting synthesis occurred. German theoretical rigor combined with American practical improvisation to create a scientific culture more powerful than either tradition alone. The space program, the computer revolution, the development of modern electronics all benefited from this synthesis. But the foundation was the recognition, painful for Germans and validating for Americans, that formal credentials were not the only or even necessarily the best path to expertise. Today, Stirling's red toolbox sits in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, displayed with a small placard explaining its significance. Museum visitors often pass it quickly, drawn to more dramatic exhibits, uniforms, weapons, large-scale equipment. They miss the profound story the toolbox tells. That wars are won not just by industrial capacity or military strategy, but by the accumulated practical knowledge of ordinary people who learned to solve problems because circumstances demanded it, who improvised because they lacked resources for proper solutions, who succeeded because they were not constrained by education that taught them what was impossible. The German scientists who encountered Stirling and soldiers like him learned a lesson more devastating than military defeat, that their culture's reverence for formal education, hierarchical expertise, and established methods had been both a strength and a fatal limitation. They learned that knowledge was more democratic, more widely distributed, more accessible to the uncredentialed than they had been taught to believe. They learned that theoretical elegance could be less valuable than practical effectiveness, that proper methods could be inferior to improvised solutions, that a farmer's son with a modified screwdriver could see possibilities that a doctorate and a precision instrument could not. This was the deeper meaning of Stirling rewiring the battlefield. Not that American soldiers were smarter than German scientists, but that American culture had created conditions where practical intelligence could flourish without credentials, where improvisation was valued over proper procedure, where the wisdom of doing was recognized as equal to the wisdom of studying. It was a profoundly democratic form of knowledge, accessible to anyone willing to engage directly with problems, unconstrained by formal hierarchies, validated by results rather than credentials. In May 1945, when Stirling sat on a concrete floor in a German mountain laboratory, surrounded by components of a sophisticated radar system, rewiring it while German scientists watched in disbelief, he was not just fixing a machine. He was demonstrating a philosophy of knowledge that had emerged from American pragmatism, frontier necessity, and democratic faith in individual capability. He was showing that expertise could come from experience rather than education, that innovation could emerge from improvisation rather than theory, that practical wisdom was not inferior to academic learning but different, equally valuable, sometimes superior. The Germans had expected Americans to be impressed by their sophisticated technology, overwhelmed by their theoretical knowledge, respectful of their credentials and expertise. What they experienced instead was an American corporal who looked at their most advanced work with the appraising eye of someone who had been fixing things since childhood, saw its limitations with practical clarity, and improved it using methods that violated theoretical principles but worked in reality. The encounter revealed a truth that Germany had not wanted to confront, that its cultural assumptions about knowledge, hierarchy, and human capability had been constraints disguised as strengths. Stirling returned to Kentucky, opened his repair shop, taught vocational students, and lived a quiet life that appeared unremarkable to those who did not know the story. But in a larger sense, his life represented something essential about American identity and American power. The belief that ordinary people, given freedom and necessity, could achieve extraordinary things. That practical knowledge was democratic, accessible, not confined to elites. That improvisation and adaptation were not inferior to formal training, but different forms of excellence, equally valuable, sometimes more so. The red toolbox, with its modified instruments and improvised solutions, symbolized this democratic knowledge. Each bent handle and ground edge represented a rejection of the notion that proper tools and proper methods were the only paths to effectiveness. Each repair performed with those adapted tools was a small victory for the idea that intelligence emerges not just from classrooms and textbooks, but from engagement, from necessity, from the accumulated wisdom of practical experience. When German scientists looked at Stirling's toolbox and his modifications to their equipment, they saw the defeat of their assumptions about how knowledge worked. When American soldiers looked at it, they saw validation of what they had always known, but their culture had not always valued. That learning by doing was real learning, that practical intelligence was real intelligence, that you did not need credentials to be expert. You needed curiosity, persistence, and the freedom to try things even if you did not know the proper way. This was what Stirling rewired. Not just German equipment, but German assumptions about knowledge. Not just battlefield technology, but the relationship between theory and practice, credentials and capability, formal education and practical expertise. His modified screwdrivers and improvised solutions represented a democratic epistemology, a belief that knowledge belonged to anyone willing to engage with problems directly, practically, without demanding permission from credentialed gatekeepers. The Germans built cathedrals of knowledge, magnificent in their theoretical sophistication. Stirling and soldiers like him built workshops of knowledge, messy and improvised but ultimately more effective. The war proved which approach produced better results under pressure. The lesson, uncomfortable for some and validating for others, remains relevant. That expertise is more democratic than hierarchies of credentials suggest. That practical wisdom deserves respect, equal to theoretical knowledge. That human capability flourishes when freed from the constraints of assuming there is only one proper path to understanding. In a German mountain laboratory in May 1945, a Kentucky farm boy rewired sophisticated equipment while scientists with doctorates watched in disbelief. The scene was humiliating for the Germans, validating for the American, and symbolic of something larger than either individual experience. A conflict between different philosophies of knowledge, different assumptions about human capability, different beliefs about where intelligence resided and how it developed. The American philosophy won not because it was morally superior, but because it was practically more effective. And in that victory lay a truth about democracy, about abundance of knowledge rather than abundance of things, about the power of distributed practical expertise over concentrated theoretical authority. Stirling's hands, moving with practiced certainty through components the Germans had designed, represented the ultimate American abundance. Not wealth or resources or industrial capacity, but the abundance of human capability when freed from assumptions about who could know and how they could learn. That abundance, distributed across millions of ordinary Americans with practical knowledge and improvisational skills, proved decisive. It remains, even now, the deepest source of American power, not what Americans have, but what they believe anyone can become.